This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter, Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 24. A Charitable Impulse. For a fortnight things ran smoothly in the Good Conduct Club. It seemed to work admirably. Not once was Jem Blythe called in as umpire. Not once did any of the manse children set the Glen gossips by the ears. As for their minor peccadilloes at home, they kept sharp tabs on each other, and gamely underwent their self-imposed punishment, generally a voluntary absence from some gay Friday night frolic in Rainbow Valley, or a sojourn in bed on some spring evening when all young bones ached to be out and away. Faith, for whispering in Sunday school, condemned herself to pass a whole day without speaking a single word, unless it was absolutely necessary, and accomplished it. It was rather unfortunate that Mr. Baker from over harbour should have chosen that evening for calling at the manse, and that Faith should have happened to go to the door. Not one word did she reply to his genial greeting, but went silently away to call her father briefly. Mr. Baker was slightly offended, and told his wife when he went home that biggest Meredith girl seemed a very shy, sulky little thing, without manners enough to speak when she was spoken to. But nothing worse came of it, and generally their penances did no harm to themselves or anybody else. All of them were beginning to feel quite cocksure that after all it was a very easy matter to bring yourself up. "I guess people will soon see that we can behave ourselves properly as well as anybody," said Faith jubilantly. "It isn't hard when we put our minds to it." She and Una were sitting on the Pollock tombstone. It had been a cold, raw, wet day of spring storm, and Rainbow Valley was out of the question for girls, though the manse and the Ingleside boys were down there fishing. The rain had held up, but the east wind blew mercilessly in from the sea, cutting to bone and marrow. Spring was late in spite of its early promise, and there was even yet a hard drift of old snow and ice in the northern corner of the graveyard. Leda Marsh, who had come up to bring the manse a mess of herring, slipped in through the gate shivering. She belonged to the fishing village at the harbour mouth, and her father had, for 30 years, made a practice of sending a mess from his first spring catch to the manse. He never darkened a church door. He was a hard drinker and a reckless man, but as long as he sent those herring up to the manse every spring, as his father had done before him, he felt comfortably sure that his account with the powers that govern was squared for the year. He would not have expected a good mackerel catch if he had not so sent the first fruits of the season. Leda was a mite of 10, and looked younger, because she was such a small, wizen little creature. Tonight, as she sidled boldly enough up to the manse girls, she looked as if she had never been warm since she was born. Her face was purple, and her pale blue, bold little eyes were red and watery. She wore a tattered print dress, and a ragged woolen comforter, tied across her thin shoulders and under her arms. She had walked the 3 miles from the harbour mouth barefooted, over a road where there was still snow and slush and mud. Her feet and legs were as purple as her face, but Leda did not mind this much. She was used to being cold, and she had been going barefooted for a month already, like all the other swarming young fry of the fishing village. There was no self-pity in her heart as she sat down on the tombstone and grinned cheerfully at Faith and Una. Faith and Una grinned cheerfully back. They knew Leda slightly, having met her once or twice the preceding summer when they had gone down the harbour with the Blythes. "Hello," said Leda. "Ain't this a fierce kind of a night? 'Tain't fit for a dog to be out, is it?" "Then why are you out?" asked Faith. "Pa made me bring you up some herring," returned Leda. She shivered, coughed, and stuck out her bare feet. Leda was not thinking about herself or her feet, and was making no bid for sympathy. She held her feet out instinctively to keep them from the wet grass around the tombstone. But Faith and Una were instantly swamped with a wave of pity for her. She looked so cold, so miserable. "Oh, why are you barefooted on such a cold night?" cried Faith. "Your feet must be almost frozen." "Pretty near," said Lida proudly. "I tell you it was fierce walking up that harbour road." "Why didn't you put on your shoes and stockings?" asked Una. "Ain't none to put on. All I had was wore out by the time winter was over," said Lida indifferently. For a moment Faith stared in horror. This was terrible. Here was a little girl, almost a neighbour, half frozen because she had no shoes or stockings in this cruel spring weather. Impulsively Faith thought of nothing but the dreadfulness of it. In a moment she was pulling off her own shoes and stockings. "Here, take these and put them right on," she said, forcing them into the hands of the astonished Lida. "Quick now, you'll catch your death of cold. I've got others. Put them right on." Lida, recovering her wits, snatched at the offered gift, with a sparkle in her dull eyes. Sure, she would put them on, and that mighty quick, before anyone appeared with authority to recall them. In a minute she had pulled the stockings over her scrawny little legs, and slipped Faith's shoes over her thick little ankles. "I'm obliged to you," she said, "but won't your folks be cross?" "No, and I don't care if they are," said Faith. "Do you think I could see anyone freezing to death without helping them if I could? It wouldn't be right, especially when my father's a minister." "Will you want them back? It's awful cold down at the harbour mouth, long after it's warm up here," said Lida slyly. "No, you're to keep them, of course. That is what I meant when I gave them. I have another pair of shoes and plenty of stockings." Lida had meant to stay a while and talk to the girls about many things, but now she thought she had better get away before somebody came and made her yield up her booty. So she shuffled off through the bitter twilight in the noiseless, shadowy way she had slipped in. As soon as she was out of sight of the manse, she sat down, took off the shoes and stockings, and put them in her herring basket. She had no intention of keeping them on down that dirty harbour road. They were to be kept good for gala occasions. Not another little girl down at the harbour mouth had such fine black cashmere stockings and such smart, almost new shoes. Lida was furnished forth for the summer. She had no qualms in the matter. In her eyes the manse people were quite fabulously rich, and no doubt those girls had slathers of shoes and stockings. Then Lida ran down to the Glen village and played for an hour with the boys before Mr. Flagg's store, splashing about in a pool of slush with the maddest of them, until Mrs. Elliott came along and bade her begone home. "I don't think, Faith, that you should have done that," said Una, a little reproachfully, after Lida had gone. "You'll have to wear your good boots every day now, and they'll soon scuff out." "I don't care," cried Faith, still in the fine glow of having done a kindness to a fellow creature. "It isn't fair that I should have 2 pairs of shoes, and poor little Lida Marsh not have any. Now we both have a pair. You know perfectly well, Una, that father said in his sermon last Sunday that there was no real happiness in getting or having, only in giving. And it's true. I feel far happier now than I ever did in my whole life before. Just think of Lida walking home this very minute with her poor little feet all nice and warm and comfy." "You know, you haven't another pair of black cashmere stockings," said Una. "Your other pair were so full of holes that Aunt Martha said she couldn't darn them any more, and she cut the legs up for stove dusters. You've nothing but those 2 pairs of striped stockings you hate so." All the glow and uplift went out of Faith. Her gladness collapsed like a pricked balloon. She sat for a few dismal minutes in silence, facing the consequences of her rash act. "Oh, Una, I never thought of that," she said dolefully. "I didn't stop to think at all." The striped stockings were thick, heavy, coarse, ribbed stockings of blue and red, which Aunt Martha had knit for Faith in the winter. They were undoubtedly hideous. Faith loathed them, as she had never loathed anything before. Wear them she certainly would not. They were still unworn in her bureau drawer. "You'll have to wear the striped stockings after this," said Una. "Just think how the boys in school will laugh at you. You know how they laugh at Mamie Warren for her striped stockings, and call her barber pole, and yours are far worse." "I won't wear them," said Faith. "I'll go barefooted first, cold as it is." "You can't go barefooted to church tomorrow. Think what people would say." "Then I'll stay home." "You can't. You know very well Aunt Martha will make you go." Faith did know this. The one thing on which Aunt Martha troubled herself to insist was that they must all go to church, rain or shine. How they were dressed, or if they were dressed at all, never concerned her. But go they must. That was how Aunt Martha had been brought up 70 years ago, and that was how she meant to bring them up. "Haven't you got a pair you can lend me, Una?" said poor Faith piteously. Una shook her head. "No, you know I only have the one black pair, and they're so tight I can hardly get them on. They wouldn't go on you. Neither would my gray ones. Besides, the legs of them are all darned and darned." "I won't wear those striped stockings," said Faith stubbornly. "The feel of them is even worse than the looks. They make me feel as if my legs were as big as barrels, and they're so scratchy." "Well, I don't know what you're going to do. If Father was home I'd go and ask him to get me a new pair before the store closes, but he won't be home till too late. I'll ask him Monday, and I won't go to church tomorrow. I'll pretend I'm sick, and Aunt Martha'll have to let me stay home." "That would be acting a lie, Faith," cried Una. "You can't do that. You know it would be dreadful. What would Father say if he knew? Don't you remember how he talked to us after Mother died, and told us we must always be true, no matter what else we failed in? He said we must never tell or act a lie. He said he'd trust us not to. You can't do it, Faith. Just wear the striped stockings. It'll only be for once. Nobody will notice them in church. It isn't like school. And your new brown dress is so long they won't show much. Wasn't it lucky Aunt Martha made it big, so you'd have room to grow in it, for all you hated it so when she finished it?" "I won't wear those stockings," repeated Faith. She uncoiled her bare, white legs from the tombstone, and deliberately walked through the wet, cold grass to the bank of snow. Setting her teeth, she stepped upon it and stood there. "What are you doing?" cried Una, aghast. "You'll catch your death of cold, Faith Meredith." "I'm trying to," answered Faith. "I hope I'll catch a fearful cold and be awful sick tomorrow. Then I won't be acting a lie. I'm going to stand here as long as I can bear it." "But, Faith, you might really die. You might get pneumonia. Please, Faith, don't. Let's go into the house and get something for your feet. Oh, here's Jerry. I'm so thankful. Jerry, make Faith get off that snow. Look at her feet. Holy cats! Faith, what are you doing?" demanded Jerry. "Are you crazy?" "No, go away!" snapped Faith. "Then are you punishing yourself for something? It isn't right if you are. You'll be sick." "I want to be sick. I'm not punishing myself. Go away." "Where's her shoes and stockings?" asked Jerry of Una. "She gave them to Lyda Marsh." "Lyda Marsh? What for?" "Because Lyda had none, and her feet were so cold. And now she wants to be sick, so that she won't have to go to church tomorrow and wear her striped stockings. But, Jerry, she may die." "Faith," said Jerry, "get off that ice bank, or I'll pull you off." "Pull away!" dared Faith. Jerry sprang at her and caught her arms. He pulled one way, and Faith pulled another. Una ran behind Faith and pushed. Faith stormed at Jerry to leave her alone. Jerry stormed back at her not to be a dizzy idiot, and Una cried. They made no end of noise, and they were close to the road fence of the graveyard. Henry Warren and his wife drove by, and heard and saw them. Very soon the Glen heard that the manse children had been having an awful fight in the graveyard, and using most improper language. Meanwhile, Faith had allowed herself to be pulled off the ice because her feet were aching so sharply that she was ready to get off anyway. They all went in amiably and went to bed. Faith slept like a cherub, and woke in the morning without a trace of a cold. She felt that she couldn't feign sickness and act a lie, after remembering that long-ago talk with her father. But she was still as fully determined as ever that she would not wear those abominable stockings to church. End of chapter 24. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter, Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 25. Another Scandal and Another Explanation. Faith went early to Sunday school, and was seated in the corner of her class pew before anyone came. Therefore, the dreadful truth did not burst upon anyone until Faith left the class pew near the door to walk up to the manse pew after Sunday school. The church was already half filled, and all who were sitting near the aisle saw that the minister's daughter had boots on, but no stockings. Faith's new brown dress, which Aunt Martha had made from an ancient pattern, was absurdly long for her, but even so it did not meet her boot tops. 2 good inches of bare white leg showed plainly. Faith and Carl sat alone in the manse pew. Jerry had gone into the gallery to sit with a chum, and the Blythe girls had taken Una with them. The Meredith children were given to sitting all over the church in this fashion, and a great many people thought it very improper. The gallery especially, where irresponsible lads congregated, and were known to whisper and suspected of chewing tobacco during service, was no place for a son of the manse. But Jerry hated the manse pew at the very top of the church, under the eyes of Elder Clow and his family. He escaped from it whenever he could. Carl, absorbed in watching a spider spinning its web at the window, did not notice Faith's legs. She walked home with her father after church, and he never noticed them. She got on the hated striped stockings before Jerry and Una arrived, so that for the time being none of the occupants of the manse knew what she had done. But nobody else in Glen St. Mary was ignorant of it. The few who had not seen soon heard. Nothing else was talked of on the way home from church. Mrs. Alec Davis said it was only what she expected, and the next thing you would see some of those young ones coming to church with no clothes on at all. The president of the Ladies' Aid decided that she would bring the matter up at the next aid meeting, and suggest that they wait in a body on the minister and protest. Miss Cornelia said that she, for her part, gave up. There was no use worrying over the manse fry any longer. Even Mrs. Dr. Blythe felt a little shocked, though she attributed the occurrence solely to Faith's forgetfulness. Susan could not immediately begin knitting stockings for Faith, because it was Sunday, but she had one set up before anyone else was out of bed at Ingleside the next morning. "You need not tell me anything but that it was old Martha's fault, Mrs. Dr. dear," she told Anne. "I suppose that poor little child had no decent stockings to wear. I suppose every stocking she had was in holes, as you know very well they generally are. And I think, Mrs. Dr. dear, that the Ladies' Aid would be better employed in knitting some for them than in fighting over the new carpet for the pulpit platform. I am not a Ladies' Aider, but I shall knit Faith 2 pairs of stockings out of this nice black yarn, as fast as my fingers can move, and that you may tie to. Never shall I forget my sensations, Mrs. Dr. dear, when I saw a minister's child walking up the aisle of our church with no stockings on. I really did not know what way to look." "And the church was just full of Methodists yesterday, too," groaned Miss Cornelia, who had come up to the Glen to do some shopping, and run into Ingleside to talk the affair over. "I don't know how it is, but just as sure as those manse children do something especially awful, the church is sure to be crowded with Methodists. I thought Mrs. Deacon Hazard's eyes would drop out of her head. When she came out of church, she said, 'Well, that exhibition was no more than decent. I do pity the Presbyterians.' And we just had to take it. There was nothing one could say." "There was something I could have said, Mrs. Dr. dear, if I had heard her," said Susan grimly. "I would have said, for one thing, that in my opinion clean bare legs were quite as decent as holes, and I would have said, for another, that the Presbyterians did not feel greatly in need of pity, seeing that they had a minister who could preach, and the Methodists had not. I could have squelched Mrs. Deacon Hazard, Mrs. Dr. dear, and that you may tie to." "I wish Mr. Meredith didn't preach quite so well, and looked after his family a little better," retorted Miss Cornelia. "He could at least glance over his children before they went to church, and see that they were quite properly clothed. I'm tired making excuses for him, believe me." Meanwhile, Faith's soul was being harrowed up in Rainbow Valley. Mary Vance was there, and, as usual, in a lecturing mood. She gave Faith to understand that she had disgraced herself and her father beyond redemption, and that she, Mary Vance, was done with her. Everybody was talking, and everybody said the same thing. "I simply feel that I can't associate with you any longer," she concluded. "We are going to associate with her, then," cried Nan Blythe. Nan secretly thought Faith had done a rather awful thing, but she wasn't going to let Mary Vance run matters in this high-handed fashion. "And if you are not, you needn't come any more to Rainbow Valley, Miss Vance." Nan and Di both put their arms around Faith and glared defiance at Mary. The latter suddenly crumpled up, sat down on a stump, and began to cry. "It ain't that I don't want to," she wailed, "but if I keep in with Faith, people'll be saying I put her up to doing things. Some are saying it now, true's you live. I can't afford to have such things said of me, now that I'm in a respectable place and trying to be a lady. And I never went bare-legged in church in my toughest days. I'd never have thought of doing such a thing. But that hateful old Kitty Alec says Faith has never been the same girl since that time I stayed in the manse. She says Cornelia Elliott will live to rue the day she took me in. It hurts my feelings, I tell you. But it's Mr. Meredith I'm really worried over." "I think you needn't worry about him," said Di scornfully. "It isn't likely necessary. Now, Faith, darling, stop crying and tell us why you did it." Faith explained tearfully. The Blythe girl sympathized with her, and even Mary Vance agreed that it was a hard position to be in. But Jerry, on whom the thing came like a thunderbolt, refused to be placated. So this was what some mysterious hints he had got in school that day meant. He marched Faith and Una home without ceremony, and the Good Conduct Club held an immediate session in the graveyard to sit in judgment on Faith's case. "I don't see that it was any harm," said Faith defiantly. "Not much of my legs showed. I wasn't wrong, and it didn't hurt anybody." "It will hurt Dad. You know it will. You know people blame him whenever we do anything queer." "I didn't think of that," muttered Faith. "That's just the trouble. You didn't think, and you should have thought. That's what our club is for, to bring us up and make us think. We promised we'd always stop and think before doing things. You didn't, and you've got to be punished, Faith, and real hard, too. You'll wear those striped stockings to school for a week for punishment. Oh, Jerry, won't a day do? 2 days? Not a whole week?" "Yes, a whole week," said inexorable Jerry. "It is fair. Ask Jem Blythe if it isn't." Faith felt she would rather submit than ask Jem Blythe about such a matter. She was beginning to realize that her offense was quite a shameful one. "I'll do it, then," she muttered a little sulkily. "You're getting off easy," said Jerry severely, "and no matter how we punish you it won't help Father. People will always think you just did it for mischief, and they'll blame Father for not stopping it. We can never explain it to everybody." This aspect of the case weighed on Faith's mind. Her own condemnation she could bear, but it tortured her that her father should be blamed. If people knew the true facts of the case they would not blame him. But how could she make them known to all the world? Getting up in church, as she had once done, and explaining the matter was out of the question. Faith had heard from Mary Vance how the congregation had looked upon that performance, and realized that she must not repeat it. Faith worried over the problem for half a week. Then she had an inspiration, and promptly acted upon it. She spent that evening in the garret, with a lamp and an exercise book, writing busily, with flushed cheeks and shining eyes. It was the very thing. How clever she was to have thought of it! It would put everything right and explain everything, and yet cause no scandal. It was 11 o'clock when she finished to her satisfaction, and crept down to bed, dreadfully tired, but perfectly happy. In a few days the little weekly published in the Glen under the name of The Journal came out as usual, and the Glen had another sensation. A letter signed Faith Meredith occupied a prominent place on the front page, and ran as follows: To whom it may concern. I want to explain to everybody how it was I came to go to church without stockings on, so that everybody will know that Father was not to blame one bit for it, and the old gossips need not say he is, because it is not true. I gave my only pair of black stockings to Leda Marsh, because she hadn't any, and her poor little feet were awful cold, and I was so sorry for her. No child ought to have to go without shoes and stockings in a Christian community before the snow is all gone, and I think the W.F.M.S. ought to have given her stockings. Of course, I know they are sending things to the little heathen children, and that is all right, and a kind thing to do. But the little heathen children have lots more warm weather than we have, and I think the women of our church ought to look after Leda, and not leave it all to me. When I gave her my stockings, I forgot they were the only black pair I had without holes, but I am glad I did give them to her, because my conscience would have been uncomfortable if I hadn't. When she had gone away, looking so proud and happy, the poor little thing, I remembered that all I had to wear were the horrid red and blue things Aunt Martha knit last winter for me out of some yarn that Mrs. Joseph Burr of Upper Glen sent us. It was dreadfully coarse yarn and all knots, and I never saw any of Mrs. Burr's own children wearing things made of such yarn. But Mary Vance says Mrs. Burr gives the minister stuff that she can't use or eat herself, and thinks it ought to go as part of the salary her husband signed to pay, but never does. I just couldn't bear to wear those hateful stockings. They were so ugly and rough and felt so scratchy. Everybody would have made fun of me. I thought at first I'd pretend to be sick and not go to church next day, but I decided I couldn't do that, because it would be acting a lie, and Father told us after Mother died that was something we must never, never do. It is just as bad to act a lie as to tell one, though I know some people, right here in the Glen, who act them, and never seem to feel a bit bad about it. I will not mention any names, but I know who they are, and so does Father. Then I tried my best to catch cold and really be sick, by standing on the snowbank in the Methodist graveyard with my bare feet until Jerry pulled me off. But it didn't hurt me a bit, and so I couldn't get out of going to church. So I just decided I would put my boots on and go that way. I can't see why it was so wrong, and I was so careful to wash my legs just as clean as my face. But anyway, Father wasn't to blame for it. He was in the study thinking of his sermon and other heavenly things, and I kept out of his way before I went to Sunday school. Father does not look at people's legs in church, so of course he did not notice mine, but all the gossips did, and talked about it, and that is why I am writing this letter to the journal to explain. I suppose I did very wrong, since everybody says so, and I am sorry, and I am wearing those awful stockings to punish myself, although Father bought me 2 nice new pairs as soon as Mr. Flagg's store opened on Monday morning. But it was all my fault, and if people blame Father for it after they read this, they are not Christians, and so I do not mind what they say. There is another thing I want to explain about before I stop. Mary Vance told me that Mr. Even Boyd is blaming the Lew Baxters for stealing potatoes out of his field last fall. They did not touch his potatoes. They are very poor, but they are honest. It was us did it, Jerry and Carl and I. Una was not with us at the time. We never thought it was stealing. We just wanted a few potatoes to cook over a fire in Rainbow Valley one evening to eat with our fried trout. Mr. Boyd's field was the nearest, just between the valley and the village, so we climbed over his fence and pulled up some stalks. The potatoes were awful small, because Mr. Boyd did not put enough fertilizer on them, and we had to pull up a lot of stalks before we got enough, and then they were not much bigger than marbles. Walter and Di Blythe helped us eat them, but they did not come along until we had them cooked, and did not know where we got them, so they were not to blame at all, only us. We didn't mean any harm, but if it was stealing, we are very sorry, and we will pay Mr. Boyd for them if he will wait until we grow up. We never have any money now, because we are not big enough to earn any. and Aunt Martha says it takes every cent of poor father's salary, even when it is paid up regularly, and it isn't often, to run this house. But Mr. Boyd must not blame the Lou Baxters any more, when they were quite innocent, and give them a bad name. Yours respectfully, Faith Meredith. End of chapter 25.